All right. Well, the question we're going to look at today is another question in political philosophy, and it relates to the obedience that is owed to the state or the governing authorities. The question we're going to look at today is the question of civil disobedience, and fundamentally, this is the question of: is it ever right? Is it ever moral to disobey the law? Is it ever moral to disobey the law? Now, of course, we've already talked about the justification of authority that the state might have over the individual. And we looked at two basic answers to that. That was the anarchist, which says, no, the state doesn't have any authority over the individual. And we also looked at social contract theory and a couple of different versions of social contract theory that all of them basically said that the government does have a moral authority over people. So this question really is reserved for those who believe that the state does have some measure of authority. For example, the anarchist, if they were asked this question, is it ever moral to disobey the state? Well, they're going to say, of course it is. Whenever a person who is exercising their freedom believes that the pursuits of the state or the demands of the state happen to be against their own interests, then sure, why not? Why not disobey? Because the individual has no moral obligation to obedience of the laws, to the laws of the state. The individual only might have a self-interested reason for obeying them. And so if there ever came a reason where the sort of cost-benefits analysis weighed on the side where it's advantageous for them to disobey the law, then sure, go ahead and disobey the law. More power to you, right? That's what the anarchist would say. Well, among those who hold to some kind of social contract theory, among those who hold to the belief that the state does wield a kind of authority over the individual, nevertheless, there still remains the question, okay, you believe that the state has a moral right to be obeyed, but is there ever an instance where that right is, where it comes to an end, where the right clearly is not absolute? Is it? If it's not absolute, then where do we bring that to an end? Where do we choose that it's okay to disobey the state? And that really is the question we're going to look at today, specifically disobedience to the state in the form of civil disobedience. Civil disobedience. Now, to acquaint us a little bit more about in what the concept of civil disobedience is, I'd like to offer a definition, maybe give a few terms to explain it too. So the definition that I would say for civil disobedience is this: civil disobedience is an illegal action performed for the purpose of making a moral protest. Civil disobedience is an illegal action performed for the purpose of making a moral protest. Let's offer a few clarifications on what exactly is civil disobedience. First of all, civil disobedience is a case where not only is an illegal action being performed, but it's also a case where those actions must be public. They must be done in public and be able to be seen by authorities. I mean, after all, if this is going to be a moral protest, then it does us no good to conceal our actions as a matter of protest. So actions must be done in the full view of the authority, must be done in the full view of the public, must be able to be seen by the authorities in order for them to do that to qualify as civil disobedience. Also, in civil disobedience, the person who is performing the action must be willing to suffer the penalty for breaking the law. They must be willing to suffer the penalty for breaking the law. Now, the reason for this is as follows. If the person is not willing to suffer the penalties for breaking the law, then basically what they are showing is a profound disrespect for the rule of law to begin with. And if a person is not willing to face the music for what they've done, then that is a demonstration of that person's lawlessness. Civil disobedience only works if the person is demonstrated to be lawful or is normally a person who has respect and high integrity and has a respect for the law to begin with. Otherwise, they're just going to be looked upon as a criminal. So a person must be willing to suffer the penalty for breaking the law that they're breaking. With civil disobedience, also a third element of that is that the persons who's going to be engaged in civil disobedience, their actions must be nonviolent. Their actions must be nonviolent, because it's very hard to claim a moral high ground if you're out there harming other people. Because harming other people, I think innately we fundamentally know that if we're bringing harm to other people, that's an immoral thing to do. And if the person who is going to be engaged in civil disobedience then is engaged in it in such a way that it brings actual violence upon another human being, then they have forfeited the moral high ground, and they're not able to justifiably say that they're protesting in a moral fashion, right? If this is all about a moral protest, basically the person who's breaking the law is saying that the law is fundamentally unjust at one point. Therefore, we need to violate it in order to demonstrate its injustice. Well, the best way to demonstrate that injustice is to break it in such a way that it can be seen, suffer the penalty for it, and do not seek to harm others while you're engaged in the process. All three of those really are what go into civil disobedience. Now, civil disobedience is different from other reasons or other forms of disobedience that people might exercise in order to sort of sway people's minds, this kind of thing. And so let me list a few of these other reasons or other ways that people are involved in disobedience, and then maybe basically contrast that with civil disobedience. So, for example, in civil disobedience, the person is willing to take the penalty for the breaking the law. They're doing it in public, and they are doing it in a nonviolent way. Well, the sort of alternative to this, or the flip side of this, the opposite of it, is what we might call criminal disobedience. Now, criminal disobedience is where people are breaking the law, but they're doing so in a way that is criminal in nature. It's exactly on those 3 points that criminal disobedience varies or differs from civil disobedience. For example, the criminal, when they're breaking the law, they don't do that in full view of the public, right? They don't want the public seeing what they're doing. They want to be able to get away with what they're doing so that they can accomplish the goals. So if they're stealing something, they can have whatever they've stolen. If they're breaking something, vandalizing something, they can get away with that. If they're trying to harm someone or kill someone, they're doing it to get away with that. The person who is being a criminal in their disobedience to the law is a person generally that doesn't have respect for the law to begin with. And so they don't want to see everybody, they don't want everybody to see what they're doing. So number two, a criminal, one who's involved in criminal disobedience also is going to be trying to get away with whatever it is that they're doing. So if it's stealing, it's stealing. If it's vandalism or rioting, it's vandalism or rioting. If it's killing, it's killing. Whatever their breach of law is, they're trying to get away with it. Whatever their crime is, they're trying to get away with it. They're not doing this as a form of moral protest. And also, there are many crimes that involve violence toward others, and certainly a person who's involved in criminal disobedience is a person who might be open to harming another person, bringing harm on them. So violence may very well be involved in criminal disobedience as well. So that would be the distinction between civil disobedience and criminal disobedience. But I think there's another sort of middle ground, if you will, because if you're thinking about civil disobedience, and the example that really brought this to my mind was I was considering the Underground Railroad during the slave days in the United States of America. And I've heard people refer to the Underground Railroad as an example of civil disobedience. However, it potentially violates all three of those principles that we've already listed as civil disobedience. For example, the Underground Railroad was not done in full view of the public. The people sort of went, it's called underground for a reason, right? They don't want to be obvious about who they are and what they're doing and where they're hiding people so that they can carry them on to freedom and so forth. So they did not do that in full view of the public. Secondly, for the Underground Railroad, they were not really wanting to suffer the penalty for the crime of which they were guilty. So people who were operators on that railroad, not just the conductors, but the various railroad stations where they would stay at, the people's houses in the South that were open to runaway slaves, they were not trying to just go and suffer the penalty for the law. I mean, it would have not been in their best interest. Not only that, but it also would not have been in the best interest of other slaves who might be trying to get away. And if they had gotten arrested and they had been taken to jail, then the slaves would have nowhere to go. They wouldn't be able to go to that house because the owners of that house, the operators of that railroad at that point, would have been arrested and been in jail or prison. So they were not trying to, they were trying not to suffer the penalty for the law that they were breaking. So that's number two. So they weren't doing it in full view of the public. They were not trying they were not trying to suffer the penalty. And then number three, there were times where violence was necessary and violence was used on the Underground Railroad as people were trying to get away from others. And of course, the hunters were probably shooting at them or let the dogs go on them or whatever. But what we see is that oftentimes they would be armed and they would be firing back so as to dissuade the people from following them, the hunters from following them. And so there were some times where violence was involved with that as well. So the Underground Railroad was not exactly, it wasn't exactly civil disobedience, although I don't know that I would call it criminal disobedience either, because it was done as a way to counter or to object to a law that was perceived to be unjust. So we might just call this kind of breaking of the law just simply resistance, right? Resistance is where there's an effort to violate the law for the purpose of effecting change. This is more of a revolutionary action. It might include acts of violence, and the one who is resisting does not submit to arresting authorities. And yet it is done again as a way of engaging and countering laws that are perceived to be unjust and that bring harm to others. So resistance is another one, probably not exactly at this point to the point of full-blown revolution, right? A sort of calling out of war or a declaration of war. That's not what we're talking. We're not exactly to that point yet. But the resistance, there is a resistance which goes a little bit. It's probably halfway between civil disobedience and basically armed revolution, if you will. And then there's another one that's calmer than both of these previous ones. There's another one that is known as conscientious refusal. Conscientious refusal is when people refuse to do a task that is assigned to them based on a moral conviction. Conscientious refusal is when a person refuses to do a task that is assigned to them based on a moral conviction. One such case of this that is relatively recent, it was I think 2015. But anyway, back in 2015, the Supreme Court handed down the decision Obergefell versus Hodges. And that decision basically was the one that opened up the door for same-sex marriage throughout the United States, for legalizing same-sex marriage throughout the United States. Well, at that point, there was a county clerk named Kim Davis, whose responsibility it was to issue marriage license to whomever applied for it. Immediately following the legalization of same-sex marriage in 2015, Ms. Davis was faced with the situation where she had to issue a marriage license to a same-sex couple. And as the court clerk, or as the county clerk there, she refused to do so. Ms. Davis was a Christian, and she did not believe that same-sex marriage is actual marriage, and therefore, and also in the state of Kentucky at that time, there were no laws that allowed for same-sex couples to be married, and there was, I believe, a constitutional amendment against it. So the Kentucky law had not worked its way out yet, and so she said, in good conscience, she could not extend the marriage license to people who are same-sex couples. Well, that received national attention, but that's an example of conscientious refusal to do a task that is assigned to you. Oftentimes, we hear about this sort of thing in relationship to the medical field. People who might have a conscientious objection to various treatments and things like this. For example, if an OBGYN doctor does not believe in abortion, or does not has a religious or moral objection to abortion, it's possible for them to not involve themselves in doing so. I know that right by us we have a Catholic hospital down here on the south side of Indianapolis, and it's very common for people who are receiving care there, seeking birth control there, are usually pointed to another hospital where they can receive birth control, because the people who work in that field oftentimes have a sort of conscientious objection toward birth control and things like that. So, but conscientious refusal is the idea that a person refuses to do a certain task because they have a moral objection to it, and it's a task that generally is required of them for whatever reason. So those are various other forms of disobedience. They're kind of related to civil disobedience, but civil disobedience is something of an animal of its own, right? It emphasizes the nonviolent. It emphasizes the place of disobedience as a protest and so forth. But that's the kind of disobedience that we'll be talking about today. So with that in mind, is it ever right and just? Is it ever moral for us to disobey the state, to disobey the government? Does the government have such authority that it can make whatever demands it wants, or are there times when the individual, even an individual who is normally obedient to the law, are there times where they can disobey as well? Well, the first answer to that question that we'll be looking at is the one that is given by Plato, and his answer is no. That basically the individual does not have the right to go against the government. They don't have the right to disobey it. And his reasoning is rather interesting, and he presents it in a dialogue that he writes known as Credo. Now, if you recall, Plato, the way that Plato writes is he generally writes his philosophy in the form of dialogues. So they're narrative dialogues. It's kind of like telling a story where Plato pits Socrates against a philosophical question of the day. And he puts into the mouth of Socrates the words that he wants the reader to assume are correct. And so Plato writes of Socrates in an event in his life that really gets at this question of is it ever right to disobey the government? And basically, to give you a little bit of idea of the context here, Socrates at this point in his life has been sentenced to death. He has been charged with impiety toward the gods and corrupting the youth. And he has been found guilty, and his death sentence has been handed down. However, in the narrative of the story, what ends up happening is that as soon as he is sentenced to death, the city goes into this festival, and the festival, I believe, lasts for 30 days. And so they can't kill him for 30 days. And so he's just sitting around in jail for 30 days, talking to people and spreading his philosophy, and whoever will come, he'll talk to them about issues related to his impending death. Well, at this particular point, one of Socrates' friends named Credo is a person who's with means. So Credo is wealthy. Credo has influence as well. And Credo has arranged, through his influence and through his wealth, he has arranged for the guard to allow Socrates to escape so that they can then take him off in exile to another city-state, a surrounding city-state. And Credo wants to do this for various reasons. He wants to do this so that because he obviously wants to help his friend Socrates, and also so that he doesn't have to suffer the regret and shame later on when if Socrates were to die, people would look at him and said, "Hey, you could have helped him." And he says, "I don't want to suffer that kind of guilt and shame, where people will think that I could have helped you, but I didn't." But Socrates is in jail, and Socrates basically refuses to go. He refuses to escape. He refuses his friend's offer of escape, and Credo's like, he can't understand why. And Socrates begins to explain this to him. And basically, he explains this by first basically asking the question, is it ever good to do evil, or is it ever good to repay evil with evil? Is it ever good to do evil? Now, that seems to be kind of like a self-evident answer, right? Or question. The answer seems to be self-evident. So is it ever good to do evil? No, it's not good to do evil. If it was good to do evil, it wouldn't be called evil, it would be called good, right? Okay. Well, is it good? Is it ever good to repay evil with evil? Now, some people would say, they may be tempted to say yes, but Socrates explains no. It's still evil to repay evil with evil. And Crito agrees with him. Yes, absolutely. It's evil to repay evil with evil, because evil is evil no matter when or where it happens. So if it's bad to repay evil with evil, then Socrates goes on to say, how much worse would it be to repay somebody who's done you good with evil? Well, surely that would be terrible. That would be a terrible miscarriage of justice. That would be wicked. Somebody who has done nothing but good to you, and you turn around and you betray them, you stab them in the back, you do them a great evil and injustice. That would be a terrible thing. Well, Socrates says, yeah, I agree with that. And Crito says, yeah, that's true. And Socrates said, I agree with that. That's absolutely good. But here's the problem, says Socrates. He's lived these 70 years or so. And as he has lived in Athens, and he's always been a citizen of Athens, from the very time that he was born until that very day that he was sentenced to death, Socrates had enjoyed the protection of the laws of Athens. But not just the laws. Remember what the laws of society do. They establish a grounds upon which people can interact and engage in society in a fashion that is peaceful, that is mutually beneficial for all. When laws are handed down and civilization is established on the basis of those laws, then culture can develop, education can develop, agriculture, technology. All of these things are possible because of the moral laws that are sort of codified into legal laws and enforced in a society. And Socrates says, man, I have enjoyed the protection and the benefits of the society of Athens for these 70 years. Athens has done good for me. I have done well in Athens. So that's what Socrates views the state. The state is there to do him good. And it has. He's lived for 70 years and he has been blessed. He talks about the wonderful things that the society has done for him and provided so that he can flourish and all these things. How then, says Socrates, how then could I repay someone who has done me so much good for so long? How could I repay them by destroying them? How could I repay them by setting aside the laws of the state? Because if I set aside the laws of the state, understand this, then basically what I am saying and what I am telling everybody who would listen to me, what I'm showing by my example, is that you can set aside the laws of the state whenever you want to. So all of these laws have been established that have been there to benefit me. They've been there for my good. The state has done much good for me. And then when it's inconvenient for me, when the laws do not seem to work out in my favor, I'm going to turn around and disobey the laws so that I can benefit myself. Well, I am bringing great harm upon the laws, because if everybody acts like I act, then society crumbles. If everybody disobeys the laws whenever the laws are inconvenient for them to obey, then that's going to do great harm to society. Now, how can I do that great evil to someone who has done me such great good? This is his reasoning behind what he says. Now, many of us might sit back and say, well, wait a second. The state also has the responsibility to make sure that their laws are just and do not bring harm upon the people that they seek to serve. Certainly, there are those, that we'll look at in just a moment, who would say that in normal cases, respect for the laws needs to be utmost. And we need to obey the law wherever we can and whenever we can. But when the law becomes tyrannical such that it is destroying individuals who pose no threat or are not breaking their laws, then the law needs to be changed. Well, Socrates clearly doesn't see things that way, because he goes on to face his execution, and he goes through with it. He has to drink hemlock, which is a kind of poison. He drinks hemlock and goes through and is killed for his belief when he could have escaped. So that was Plato's view as presented through the mouth of Socrates, and that represents his understanding of why one should never disobey the law. Now, his sentiments are really echoed in some ways, although I think even in a stronger form put forth by Thomas Hobbes. You'll recall we talked about Thomas Hobbes as being one of the architects of the social contract theory, and Thomas Hobbes believes that in the state of nature that nobody has any rights, right? And the only time that we establish rights or protections is when we establish the social contract. And that means that we come together as a society, we establish these laws that prevent us from doing certain actions that are found to be contrary to human flourishing. So we don't kill one another, we don't lie to one another, we don't steal from one another, and so on and so on. All these things are contrary to human flourishing. So when we establish those laws and I obey those laws and everybody else obeys those laws, things are going great. But Hobbes believes that we have no inherent or intrinsic natural right to life or right to property or right to be told the truth or any of those things. Those things only come out of the social contract. So that when we appoint a sovereign over us, that sovereign is not bound by the same kind of rules that you and I are bound by. The sovereign is the one who's supposed to enforce the contract, but the sovereign is not the one who has to obey those laws. So the sovereign can kill, and the sovereign can steal. Think eminent domain, right? They can lie. They can do these things that normally we can do in the state of nature. But since they're the only ones who have the authority to do that, then they can enforce the contract that we hold ourselves to. Well, here's the problem that many people see with Hobbes's version of social contract, is that since it doesn't appeal to the existence of natural rights, then whenever the sovereign becomes a tyrant, basically, there's no justification for political revolution. There's no justification because the way that Hobbes looks at it is this: if you revolt against the state, which essentially is what disobedience is. If you disobey the state, if you revolt against the state, you are basically destroying that construct, that structure that provides for human flourishing. You say, well, yeah, but the laws are unjust. Well, they may very well be unjust, but they're not unjust for everybody. And certainly the laws, even if we might perceive them to be unjust, if we don't like them, certainly those laws are not always going to be detrimental to our health. And it's better that we have some laws, even bad ones, than no law whatsoever, because human passions will drag us down into anarchy, and that will eventuate in the war of all against all. So Hobbes's version of social contract was used to justify things like the divine right of kings. We should not disobey the king, because if we do, then if we overthrow the king, then we have no authority. Nobody's there. We have anarchy, and that's going to be the war of all against all. That's going to be the state of nature. It's going to be terrible. So that was Hobbes's version of the social contract. And it would probably line up very well with Plato's understanding of social contract as well. Now, I want you to see a couple of things that this argument is based on. This argument is based on both a consequentialist consideration and what we might call a deontological consideration. The consequentialist consideration of Plato's argument and of Hobbes, as I've mentioned, the consequentialist argument is this: that the consequences of disobedience that can be that lawlessness will abound. And because lawlessness will abound, it is better for us to obey laws, even if they're unjust, than it would be to just do away with them altogether. So the consequences of disobedience can be that lawlessness will abound. That's what, practically speaking, might happen if we are involved in disobedience. The other one is the deontological argument, and basically this argument is a rights-based argument. It recognizes rights and obligations, that we have a moral obligation, even aside from the consequences that are involved. And here's how this one goes. The deontological argument goes like this. It says, when someone does good for you, they obligate you to do good for them. When someone does good for you, they obligate you. There's an obligation that you incur to do good for them. This is kind of like, somebody bought you a Christmas present, so you need to go buy them a Christmas present. It's that oughtness that you feel, right? And Plato would say, look, the state has done well for me, that's done good for me, therefore I am obligated to do good for them, even when it's not necessarily convenient for me. So that's the deontological consideration there. All right. Well, Hobbes, Plato, Socrates, they would have been all for the idea of obeying the state, even in cases where the state's laws or edicts or this sort of thing would have been detrimental to you or inconvenient to you. However, there are those who believe that there are certain times where it is good and right to disobey the government. And there are many reasons for this. In fact, they would argue in a deontological way that we have an obligation to disobey in certain cases, that we have a duty to disobey unjust laws, if you will. Now, why do we have a duty to disobey unjust laws? Well, we must disobey unjust laws in order to preserve moral integrity. We have a duty to disobey unjust laws in order to preserve moral integrity. If we fancy ourselves to be a moral people, and let's say, for example, we have slavery going on in our nation, and yet we want to talk about how moral we are, can we just agree that if we are a slave-holding nation, we are not a nation that has the moral high ground in many situations? That because we engage in and we justify a terribly immoral practice, then we have lost all pretense of moral integrity. The only way that we establish moral integrity is if we do away with the unjust, immoral laws. So we have a duty to disobey unjust laws. Not only that, but we also have a duty to combat immorality. We have a duty to combat immorality. When immorality runs rampant around us, we have the obligation, we have the duty to combat it, to work against it. Because what happens if we don't? If we don't work against immorality and immorality abounds, then the whole world is going to descend into immorality and debauchery, and that can be pretty much suicidal for society as large. Another reason that we have a duty to disobey unjust laws, says those who believe in civil disobedience, is because civil disobedience can be a means of social progress. When a person engages in civil disobedience, it highlights the injustice of the law that is being addressed, and that raises awareness, and awareness eventually results in action one way or the other, and so it serves to help one progress socially. Yet another reason that we have a duty to disobey unjust laws is because we need to do it when there is no practical alternative. In other words, try as much as you can to address the injustice in a way that does not involve just a out and out disobedience to it. But when all of those doors have been shut in your face, when all of those doors have been closed and you have no other alternative whatsoever, there's no practical way of addressing it otherwise, then yes, go ahead and break it. We have the duty, the obligation to break it. Now, people who espouse civil disobedience might say that it would be prudent and it would probably be more productive for us at first to try to address the issue in a way that doesn't involve disobeying the law. But if a significant amount of time has lapsed since we've tried to engage it and we're getting nowhere, then yes, we need to go ahead and just disobey the law. And if we don't have, and one last reason that we have a duty to disobey unjust laws is because if we don't disobey unjust laws, then the government may exceed its authority. It may exceed its authority. You see, the government has certain restrictions placed on it. In our particular context, those restrictions are enumerated in the Bill of Rights, for the federal government anyway. And the Bill of Rights are a series of actions or activities that the state must either A, not involve themselves into, in the case, for example, of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, these kind of things. So the state does not involve themselves in those things one way or the other. They just let people exercise those as they wish. Or the state might involve itself in certain activities to ensure that people's rights are maintained, such as the state might involve itself in providing an attorney for anyone who's accused of a crime, so that that person can have an adequate defense against the laws of the state that would be seeking to prosecute them. So the Bill of Rights is there in order to ensure that our rights as individuals are not trampled on, or not violated. Now, if there comes a time where a law sort of encroaches upon those rights, then maybe that's when we just need to out and out disobey it, because if we don't outright disobey it, the government might just continue to take a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. So we should disobey. We have a duty to disobey unjust laws, because if we don't, then the government never is practically checked, right? All right, so those are some elements of civil disobedience, and those are some aspects of it. A couple of one example of civil disobedience really that serves as an archetype in the American context is of course Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. King was a civil rights activist who involved himself in nonviolent protest. In his short treatise, A Letter from a Birmingham Jail, Dr. King outlines something of his theory of civil disobedience, sort of a passive, nonviolent way of dealing with the aggressors that he faced. But in this work, and it's a fantastic work, I encourage you to read it. What was the context behind A Letter from a Birmingham Jail is that Dr. King had gone and participated in a protest. He had been imprisoned, or he had been jailed for the evening. He had been arrested and put in jail, and he was writing a letter to the clergy of his day. Now, why the clergy, you might ask? Why was he writing a letter to pastors and things like this? Well, because part of his strategy of addressing the issue of civil rights was to try to engender sympathy for the cause among people who were not currently involved in the fight. And so he would go to those people who were not currently involved in the fight, and the way that he did that is he would get himself arrested, and he would get himself on the evening news, so that as the people are getting ready to wind down their day and they're watching the news, they would see these things going on, and they would see these protests, which from his perspective, from his side, were completely nonviolent, and they would see how unjust and unrighteous those laws were that were allowing for segregation to continue to take place. And anyway, in his letter, in his Birmingham jail letter, Dr. King seeks to justify when a law is unjust and when a law is just. Now, remember, he's going to be encouraging pastors of all people that it is your duty before God to disobey unjust laws. And in the context of doing this, he has to tell what is an unjust law. And Dr. King gives a few explanations of what constitutes an unjust law. For example, he says that a just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. Now, in this particular quote from Dr. King, what we see here is that he is appealing to the theory of natural law. The theory of natural law says that there is a law that is found in nature that we can use reason to discover, and that is the basis for all of our laws as well. He's pulling on traditions from people like John Locke, Samuel Rutherford, who was a Puritan. He was I believe he was a judge. I could be wrong on that. But anyway, he wrote the magnum opus Lex Rex, right? Which was it was the foundation for English common law probably up until the mid-1900s. But Rutherford wrote Lex Rex, and Lex Rex, basically the idea was that there's this natural law, and for Rutherford, that law was the law of God. Lex Rex means the law is king, and he believed that the law was the law of God, that even the king could not disobey. Even the king was obligated to obey the law because the law was a law of nature. Well, what Dr. King is pulling from is this rich tradition of natural law, and he's saying, look, if there's a man-made code that is not squared with the law of God or with the law of nature, then that man-made code is itself unjust, and we have a duty and an obligation to disobey it. He goes on to give a few elements of what constitutes an unjust law in his situation. When he says an unjust law is when the majority binds the minority but does not bind itself. An unjust law is when the majority binds the minority and yet does not bind itself. In other words, what he's saying here is that the law does not apply equally among all people, that it favors certain groups of people and does not apply equally to everyone. And Dr. King continues to go on. He specifically applies this criteria to segregation, which was the practice of keeping people of different racial backgrounds separate from one another for the purpose of sort of quarantining them, if you will, from one another. And he says segregation is unjust because it relegates persons to the status of things, and it degrades a person's personhood. Segregation is unjust because it relegates persons to the status of things, and it degrades a person's personhood. Now, in this, we hear echoes of Immanuel Kant, who says basically that we should always and in every case treat other rational beings as ends in themselves and not means only. But that's exactly what Dr. King is getting at here. He's like, look, people are people, humans are humans, and we are on a different level than all the other things in this world. So there's nothing in this world that is the status of a person except for a person, and they have infinitely more value than things do. So segregation, he would say, is an unjust law because it treats people like things. It treats them, for example, like cattle. Because let's say, for example, you are trying to breed cattle to get a certain characteristic. Well, how are you going to do that? Well, one way that you do that is you segregate the cows who have that attribute from the ones who don't, and then you only allow the cows who have that attribute to reproduce with one another. The ones who don't are kind of put off to the side. So you involve yourself in segregation, and segregation does that. It treats people like animals. It treats people like things. But clearly, Dr. King saw the value in civil disobedience. Clearly, he saw that the value in using nonviolence to address the issues of his day. Because if he had gone and used violence, like some people in his day did, some of his contemporaries did, then he probably would not have been heard. In fact, probably what would have happened was that the forces and the powers that be would have been considered themselves justified in using violence to quell the violence that was going on. And so what Dr. King did was actually very, very intelligent, very smart, very ingenious man, utilizing nonviolence in order to address the issue of his day. But he did that through civil disobedience. He did that through breaking the law and being willing to accept the penalty that was going to come. He did it in public, and he did it in a way that was nonviolent. All of this to show that he respected the law, that he did not wish ill or harm on his fellow man, and he would gladly and joyously endorse the law if the law were just. So those are elements that are critical for civil disobedience. Well, make sure that you read the syllabus and do all of the work that is associated with this particular module, and we will see you next time. Have a great one.